switch to a hotspot with my phone. So let me give.
Sounds good. We're recording now. Okay, perfect. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Manaswita, and on behalf of Focus Aphasia, we're very excited to welcome Dr. Julie Hengst, who's going to be talking to us about situated discourse analysis. So this is a two-part workshop. Today is the first day, and the second part of the workshop will take place on May 27th at the same time, so 1 p.m. Eastern. Just a couple of announcements before we get started. If you need a letter of attendance for today, please email Dr. Brielle Stark at bcstark@iu.edu, and I'm happy to share her email in the chat soon. Second is Dr. Hengst has shared all the materials for today's workshop on our website, which is focusaphasia.com. And then finally, if you have questions that arise along the way, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'm happy to read them out to Dr. Hengst as we go along, or you can ask them yourself. We were just talking, this is more of a workshop rather than a talk, so we want it to be as interactive as possible. All right, well, thank you so much again, Dr. Hengst, and thank you everybody for joining in. I will let you take it from here. Thank you.
Right, so let me get my slides set up. There we go. Is that working for everyone?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. So first, I just want to really thank, Bree and Manaswita and the rest of the Focus Aphasia group for inviting me to do this workshop. What I'm going to be doing, like I said, is this, two-part one, as Manaswita told you, and this today is the first part. All of it will be drawing fairly heavily from my recent 2020 book, Understanding Everyday Communicative Interactions. So just a little background on me. My path to situated discourse analysis emerged from a combination of both academic and studies and reflecting on my practical experiences. In my undergrad in linguistics, I learned about field methods of descriptive linguistics and semiotics. And of course, my clinical master's at Wisconsin introduced me to the complexities of communication disorders. And then I did a PhD in speech comm, actually, with Peggy Miller, where I focused on qualitative theories and methods to study everyday interactions, drawing on ethnography of communication, microsociology, ethnomethodology, discourse analysis, social linguistics, cultural developmental psychology. And along the way, I had lots of practical experiences, including teaching English as a foreign language in Saudi Arabia, working as a medical SLP in 3 different hospitals, and doing some private practice, community-based interventions and AAC here in Champaign, and working as a clinical supervisor. So across all these experiences, even in the most controlled context of classrooms and clinics, I was repeatedly struck by the sheer complexity of everyday interactions and by the need of participants to juggle and even fuse multiple roles moment by moment. So that's what I set out to study in my research program, beginning with, during my doctoral work, an ethnographic study of Cindy Magic, and then turning my attention to ethnographic studies of people with aphasia and amnesia. And that sort of pink and green boxes is what we're going to focus on today. And then the blue boxes push to more translational studies, and that's what we will look at next time. So just briefly, you'll see that the fourth thing on the agenda is a Q&A time. So that's a spot where we'll have a time for a few questions. And then also at the end, I'm going to give you an observational activity to work on during the 2 weeks between these two times. And I can actually stay a little bit later after the hour if people have questions, or you can email me. So what do I mean by communicative interactions? Wow, this is just what fills our every day, right? We all can imagine things. Here's just a few examples of the kinds of things that this would include. 2 people planning a vacation through a series of written interactions over several months, or a group of friends in an impromptu, rapid face-to-face interaction over just a few minutes as they decide where and when to meet for dinner. The uneven pacing of social media sites, where you posts that mix words and images and videos and audios, and sometimes they're done synchronously and other times they're done across weeks and months. And then of course the real-time, more formal, synchronous in-person meetings like this one that can be done either through Zoom, face-to-face, or in some combination. So the challenge for CSD is that these are complex, dynamic, variable. They resist simple categorizations. And in fact, many times what people talk about in describing this is there's something about the whole of these interactions that is greater than the sum of the parts. So why do we want to study this? My argument is, research-wise and theoretically, we need to interpret all of our CSD work from how it relates to these kinds of everyday environments. Think about a hearing aid. It's not just so they do better on a hearing exam, but it's so that they can communicate in everyday lives. And in fact, that's the goal of all of our clinical work, is to optimize communication in everyday lives. And it's what our clients tell us over and over they want to get better at. Something that we don't look at quite as much is that it's also the means of our work. As a behavioral field, this is how we assess, treat, counsel clients. We talk with them. It's how we document what we do and write about it. So let's start with discourse. Discourse is a tricky term. Herbert Clark differentiated two broad traditions that can sort of describe what people mean by discourse. One are a collection of product traditions where discourse is a thing, and the other is what he called action traditions, which is where discourse is seen as a process. Even the Oxford English Dictionary highlights these distinctions in our everyday usage, defining discourse both as a body of statements or a more or less formal treatment of a subject matter like a treatise, or as a conversation, the act of processing or the action or process of communicating thought by means of the spoken word. In everyday talk, we have no trouble shifting between these, but for clinical work or for research, we need to be more systematic. So we've looked at the technical usage of discourse in linguistics, and linguistics tends to differentiate language forms from contexts, and discourse then becomes the relationship between language and context. So traditional linguistic approaches, the context here is syntax bigger than a sentence. So that leads to things like anaphora and story grammars. Social linguistics tends to look at things like the geographic locations, the social groupings of people, and that leads to things like looking at national languages, dialects, and registers. And in systemic functional linguistics, discourse points to the semantic pragmatic context, and it looks at how language and language forms can signal speakers and addressees, can reference worlds, and can be packaged in what they would call textually small genres, okay? Across all these, though, language is a relatively closed system that may be augmented or affected by different gestures, actions, and contexts. In contrast, the process side comes from a lot of fields besides linguistics, and it like sociology and anthropology, and it points to communication or language in use as something that unifies texts and context, so we don't keep them separate. And they're unified in the flow of embodied interactions. So this is a way of highlighting social cultural activities, how talk aligns with and shapes what people are doing, and cultural practices, how our ideologies or beliefs about language use and language users shapes what happens in interactions, who gets to talk when and under what circumstances. From this perspective, communication involves semiotic configurations, so verbal plus nonverbal resources that are inextricably bound together in action. This is tricky. I mean, getting a handle on these different traditions often feels like this sort of ambiguous figure that we have seen so many times before. So when you first see this figure, you might see the vase or you might see the two faces, but it's very hard once you've seen one to shift to the other. So this is the same thing. If we've been trained and exposed to the product traditions, it's work to actually shift to the process traditions and vice versa. So with that background, how do I define situated discourse analysis? Together, discourse then is conceptualized as these dynamic communicative processes, not simply the products, and that it may or may not include linguistic forms, right? The situated part of this name highlights that communicative processes always emerge in materially, spatially, and temporally constituted situations, and also that such situations are linked to past events and other contexts and projected futures. And then analysis highlights that it's a common task of researchers and participants alike. In other words, participants are trying to figure out what's going on and making sense of it, and that's what we're doing as analysts. So situated discourse analysis for CSD is important because it focuses on the communicative interactions as the object of study. It draws on theoretical and methodological approaches to examine how people navigate everyday communicative interactions in real time. And it aims to describe how people successfully communicate and learn to do so. And it sets us up to translate research findings for clinical practice. It does not focus on populations. It doesn't, it's not easy to set up clinical behavioral profiles from this. It does not focus on particular systems of resources or isolated dimensions of communication like turn-taking, eye contact, or etiquette. So let's move on now to talk about, oops, sorry, that was my book that just dropped. Talking about the situated discourse analysis framework. This involves social cultural activities, participation, and communicative resources. Oops. So CSD responds centrally to Delheim's challenge for us to begin with the social matrix. He said, when doing an ethnographic approach, it will not do to begin with language or standard linguistic description and look outward at the social context. A crucial characteristic of the social linguistic approach is that it looks in toward language, as it were, from the social matrix. To begin with language or an individual code is to invite the limitations of the purely correlational approach and to miss much of what the organization of linguistic phenomena. Functions and contexts of use joined together, what structural description by itself may leave asunder. So SDA draws on ethnographic approaches in order to begin with the social matrix. So this chart is in your handout, and it offers guiding questions to help skilled observers, such as clinicians, focus on the whole of communicative interactions. Along the left side, labeling the rows are the three key dimensions I just mentioned: social cultural activities, people's participation, and communicative resources. And then the column headings focusing on three ways that we can use SDA to just simply describe the dynamic complexities of interactions, identifying success in interaction, and tracing learning interaction. And so I've adapted the questions for each of these goals. So this is just a useful framework, and we'll be using some of these questions this time and next time. So what do I mean by social cultural activities? They're best defined by the goals or objectives people are working to accomplish. This is the dimension that I'd say most of my students and people who are just beginning to take up this approach have trouble with, because as competent communicators, activities are tacitly understood, quite easily recognized, and we navigate them fluidly in our everyday lives. But as researchers and clinicians, we have to do more. We have to systematically name, categorize, and trace how they unfold. So categories can be these bounded, recognizable, and easily named things, like a wedding, a card game, a shopping trip, class meetings, a dinner, a game. These are ones that the goals are quite widely understood. They have recognizable roles people align around, even when they're organized in very different ways. Take, for example, weddings. They all look different, but they all do the same kind of thing. Activities can also be dispersed, less easily recognized, like being a friend, managing reputations, building a professional career. These goals may be clear, but the features are diffuse, and they are always integrated with other activities. Think about passing that anatomy class in grad school is a step toward having a clinical career. And then, of course, there's the daily routine embodied fleeting activities of localizing unexpected noises and managing self-care in public. So in thinking about activity like this, Irving Goffman made a very important observation, that interactions always involve multiple activities and hence are laminated or layered, which means that people routinely are juggling multiple frames and footings in interactions. That the moment by moment stances that people take around these various activities and goals and people and talk can be watched, can be followed. So to do this, Goffman started his analysis always from the gathering. In other words, documenting, looking at, attending to all the co-present people, whether they're engaged in the same activity or not. And then honed in on the interaction orders, looking at the recognizable ways people align with one another around various activities, such as, walking together down a sidewalk, or lining up to buy tickets, or circling around to watch a street performer. At the same time, Levin-Wenger's theory of situated learning offers another foundational perspective that relates to this. They define learning as ongoing socialization and view learning as ubiquitous. That, in other words, it's found everywhere, not just in marked moments of teaching. Levin-Wenger's theory of situated learning then captures not only how people learn social practices, but also how those practices are constantly changing and developing. So everything's changing at once. The important thing that I focused on is that given that Levin-Wenger defined learning as people's changing patterns of participation in practices, we can take up Goffman's notion of footings as a way to trace that learning. So let's look at patterns of participation. This is the second part of the framework of SDA. It involves starting with the social material space. This recognizes that these material spaces around us involve people and things and have social histories associated with them, and that many of these spaces are designed or built to optimize particular patterns of participation, such as concert halls, dining rooms, and intersections. Interaction orders, then, is the way we read those spaces. It's the typical bodily alignments of people participating in various activities, as Goffman said. So, for example, in these pictures, you can tell when people are walking across the intersection, or when somebody is doing a street performer, like in the bottom picture, and people circle around to watch. He also highlights the importance of attending. Goffman highlights the importance of attending to talk. So the way we participate in moments of talk varies. So listeners aren't just listeners. They can be ratified addresses, known overhears, or even eavesdroppers that we're not aware of. And even the speaker of an utterance is going to be aligned with that utterance in different ways. They could be animating the talk, speaking or writing it. They can be authoring the talk, deciding what to say, and they can be the principalship of the talk. And all of these can be the same or different in any given interaction. So the last one of the three pillars of communicative disorder, of CSD, of situated discourse analysis, sorry about that, is communicative resources. So SDA draws on semiotics to characterize the communicative resources of interactions. Signs are anything that stand for something else, but in situated discourse analysis, we're not looking at these in a vacuum. It's always an interaction. So Peirce observed, for example, that signs always stand to somebody for something in some respect or capacity. And Sebiak defines signs as a sign source that's coupled by a channel to a destination. All of these are somewhat interactional, relational. So sensory motor modalities, as defined by neuroscience, gives us a way to begin to think about the coupling of signs to destinations through channels. And everyone's quite familiar with these, I'm sure, thinking about the visual, oral, tactile, and olfactory kinds of modalities. However, it's important to remember that in use in everyday interactions, even the most system-like codes of resources never appear alone. And so what anchors my definition of communicative resources is this quote by Agha, that even language in use is an array of signs being performed and construed by interactives, of which language is but a fragment of a multi-channel sign configuration. Whew, that's a mouthful, a multi-channel sign configuration. I often use the term orchestration of resources to get to that. This is the key. Okay. Now that we've got some of the basic definitions behind us, let's look at some examples of communicative practices from my data. So this first one was in my actual dissertation study, where I was looking at the pretend game of Cindy Magic, played by my husband and my two daughters. I chose this one because as a novice, I was just learning how to employ ethnographic methods, and this made it logistically easier because I had insider status to this family, but I didn't play the game myself. But more importantly, I was also very intrigued by the complexity of the communicative nature of this pretend game, as well as how long they played it, and how it emerged and developed over time. So Paul and Nora had first played it 4 years before this. Nora, who had loved animals, had just seen the 101 Dalmatians, and she was very upset about Cruella de Vil. So she imagined a heroic counter character called Cruella Magic. So initially the game involved a simple routine. Paul simply was an animal parent seeking their missing babies. Hello, I'm Holly Hippopotamus. I've lost my children. And then Nora, playing Cruella Magic, always had them and returned them safely. The game grew over the next 4 years with more characters and more elaborate plots. And at the time of the research, Nora typically was playing Mary Magic, who was the oldest daughter of Cruella Magic's sister, Cindy Magic. Paul played Mary's younger sister, Elizabeth, and then Anna played the youngest sister, Jane. I studied Cindy Magic for 2 years, keeping field notes about play, video recording episodes, and interviewing Paul, Nora, and Anna, and then checking with them about my evolving analyses. So as part of the project, I developed a transcription system informed by Goffman's notion of footings. So this transcription continuously displays the gathering of people co-present in the interaction, not just the speakers. It's set up like a musical score, which means that the temporal unfolding on talk happens with each speaking line stacked, so you can easily see overlapping talk. Nonverbal vocalizations like laughing are described in square brackets, while other actions are marked by an asterisk and described below the speaking lines. And then I use different fonts to capture the different character voices that people were using that were marked by shifts in prosody, language, and gestures. So using the SDA framework, we can begin to explore what's going on in these interactions, how the people are participating, and what communicative resources are being used. So I identified 3 key activities: playing Cindy Magic, folding laundry, and filming for the research study. Cindy Magic was strongly verbally mediated by Paul, Nora, and Anna, speaking for the Magic sisters, Mary, Elizabeth, and Jane. The scenarios emerged in play. They weren't pre-planned, and I stayed off camera as a silent observer. The folding laundry activity was strongly non-verbally mediated by Nora, Paul, and Anna. They selected, folded, and stacked items. And it was jointly managed by them, although I had clearly helped with setup before this observation, before the gameplay. And in fact, I think I'd washed the laundry, but was a silent off-camera observer during the folding. And then the research study was non-verbally mediated by Paul, Nora, and Anna actively disattending to the research and performing for the video camera during play. And I, of course, was silently managing the camera off video. It's important to remember, too, that the social material space here was sort of designed and organized to support these 3 activities. So we picked the family room with a laundry basket because it was a common space for such chores. We often folded laundry in front of the TV. It also had good lighting and sufficient distance for the camera. And Paul, Nora, and Anna, as they circled around the basket there, were within auditory space for the verbal game. So how are resources indexing and pointing to potential identities and roles? SDA supports both quantitative and qualitative analysis, and the communicative resources are ones that we can pretty easily operationalize for reliable counting. And we can select ones that then also focus on the interactional work the participants are doing, not just the forms. So here's just an example of 2 quickly. One of the things we did is we counted and noted the number of voices that the different players were using throughout the scenes. So this was an 11-minute episode, and it's on the left there, you can see is just a list of the voices that they used. And on the right, the other thing we did is we counted the modes of address. So I was particularly interested when they addressed people by some name. So we analyzed all the turns and looked at how many turns were directed at one person, not like to the general crowd. So for example, 129 of Paul's turns, he directed to a particular person. Of those, 57 of them, he used a direct address of a character, Mary, Elizabeth, Jane, or of a person, Nora, Anna, Paul, for example. It was interesting that 45 or almost 80% of those actually were during the Cindy Magic play, and only 12 or 21% were during family activities. And you can see that he used the most, but Nora still used quite a few, and Anna used very few, and she only used direct address when talking to Dad, actually, in this tape. So, and of course, other activities emerged. This is just an example from our 2006 publication that looked at an unexpected activity of cleaning the mud off the rug. So just shortly after they started playing, Paul noticed a muddy spot on the rug, and he shifted everybody out of gameplay and folding by shifting from looking, from handling the clothes to looking over and touching the muddy spot on the rug. He started addressing Nora and Anna by name, used his dad voice. He asked questions, gave directions, and actually Nora and Anna broadly complied with this, using this break in play and time to clean up to also check in with me about the video camera. When they were done cleaning up the mud, Paul shifted them back quickly, just simply by starting to speak as Elizabeth again and making a note that the noise reminded him of Cruella de Vil. And Nora and Anna jumped into their Mary and Jane roles, and they quickly moved on. Another interesting thing for us is the way they focused on the rug. So when it was muddy, it was our living room rug and had mud on it. When they joined back to the game, it became, they still focused on it, but they repurposed it as the backyard. So they were gathered around as if they're looking out a window at the backyard where Cruella de Vil is. This kind of repurposing of things was very common in interactions. So let's turn our attention now to discourse and aphasia. This was my dissertation study, and I designed it as an ethnographic study to examine the discourse patterns among routine partners managing aphasia. So a couple key things about the design is I recruited people with aphasia and asked them to invite a partner. So the cases were all participant pairs. Another key thing was that I recorded under multiple conditions. So I videotaped everything, including community observations, barrier task sessions held in the clinic, and 4 semi-structured interviews with each pair. Data analysis involved fully transcribing everything and using the transcripts to support coding from the videos and doing a triangulated analysis across the data. I want to look at an example here from Steve's case. Steve was 33 years old at the time and 4.5 years past a severe stroke. He had conduction aphasia and was 100% disabled using SSDI standards. He had been and still was an avid athlete and sports fan, and prior to the stroke, he was working as a physician. He invited his wife as his partner for the study, and full disclosure, I had been working clinically with them prior to the study, providing community-based interventions. So this is his third observation. It's him at a volunteer football game. It's important to note that he had been a volunteer physician in the sports medicine program that supported this team. And even since the stroke, he continued to attend those clinics as an observer. So what I liked about this data is it really highlighted the important identity work of all everyday interactions. So this was at a high school football game. You know, the social material space people here are probably quite familiar with. It has very specialized areas, the field for gameplay, the specialized spaces for the home team and the visiting team, a ticketed entrance. And all of these are somewhat policed in terms of who can be where. So Steve, though, had privileged access to the home team spaces, to the activities, and to the people. He attended all the pregame activities in the locker room. He watched from the sidelines. He interacted with coaches and trainers. And in fact, he hosted us on the sideline and introduced me to others and told me about the players. But he could no longer practice medicine or attend injured players on the field, and he was no longer an insider to the medical decisions being made. his communicative engagement in these spaces also highlighted different identities. He was an avid sports fan, and he used what I would call a sports fan register, shouting encouragement to players during the game. He also was really interested still in sports medicine. And even though he wasn't a practicing physician, he focused on that. So when there was an injury early in the game, he went down, talked to the people, the trainers, the medics, and came back to report to us what was going on using fairly technical terms. It's looking bad, first thing. They think he broke his tibia, I think he told us, and it went on from there. And he, of course, used these to reflect on his own personal situation, lamenting that he just loved being a physician and he just can't do that anymore. So this next example I want us to look at is from an ethnographic study of potential AAC users on campus. And this was a study designed to support the development of AAC technologies for face-to-face interactions. So in order to understand what people are doing, we looked to those everyday interactions. The case it was also collected ethnographically, so here's some details about it. But the case I want to focus on is Jesse's. At the time, Jesse was 30 years old. He was a doctoral student, and he reported his diagnosis of CP was made in infancy. He had pretty significant dysarthria. He used a wheelchair and employed personal assistants to help him with ADLs. He used assistive technologies for all of his writing work on campus, but he no longer used an AAC for speech and said he never would again. He invited a PA that he liked a lot, Karen, for the on-campus observation. And again, I knew Jesse before the study through some shared committee work on campus. So we're going to look at his second observation. This was him going to the student union for several errands. He was going to return some books, and he wanted to shop for a remote control to use when he lectured. So brokering, we like this example because it really highlights the way people broker each other's participation in everyday communicative interactions. So what do I mean by brokering? Brokering involves using verbal and nonverbal resources as well as experiences with social cultural activities and roles to mediate communicative interactions. It offers a way to describe how participation and communicative success are distributed. And we thought, for the purpose of this study, that successful brokering would provide a potential model for new designs for AAC devices. So this is a picture of Jesse and Karen talking to the store clerk. Across this short interaction, Karen, the PA, did brokered Jesse's involvement in multiple ways. First, she verbally translated his unintelligible spoken word clickers for the store clerk. So clickers, she said, "Oh, clickers, I'm sorry," and then looking both at them back and forth. But once they got clickers, it didn't clarify what he was shopping for. So then she worked to clarify what kind of clickers by doing sort of an embodied enactment, using an imagined presentation remote and using a hand as sort of a PowerPoint screen, and saying, yeah, like if you're giving a presentation, if you have PowerPoint up and you need to, right? She then, once they had figured out what they wanted, and the clerk was taking them back to the right spot to see the devices, she took on the role of an enthusiastic co-shopper. Actually, I could totally use one of those. Do you guys sell those? She asked. And finally, she shifted to a socializing role with Jesse, joining as a friend in a laugh of surprise when they asked the clerk what was the difference in the devices, and she simply said their color. Okay, we have some time, I think, for a couple questions. That's a lot we've covered, but we've gotten through the big stuff. Manaswita, did anybody send any questions in?
No, I'm monitoring it. So if anybody has questions, please post them in the chat. Yes, and you can ask them yourselves too.
All right. Well, if there aren't questions yet, maybe there will be next. So,
There are questions coming.
oh, are there? Okay.
I can read them out to you. Okay, so Miko asks, brokering sounds like using communicative resources to elicit co-constructional help from other participants. Is there a layer of CA to these analyses?
That's a great question. Yes, I would say that CA as a type of ethnomethodology from sociology has really been one of the traditions that I've drawn on. So yes, you'll see some of those influences here. And I think the interesting thing for me for situated discourse analysis is it's assumed that it's always distributed. They're not just particular moments of joint construction, although there are these highly marked ones where we might see that. But that it's always distributed. So brokering points to the way that we should be looking for patterns of brokering all the time in every interaction, and some will be much more dynamic and overt than others.
Yes, great, thank you. Gloria Allness asks, I wonder how a typical structured clinical interaction could be modeled like you did for the football context.
Oh, that's another great question. We'll get into that more in the next section, in the next talk in 2 weeks, in part 2. I really think, where we're going with this, with rich communicative environments, really gives us a framework to do that very work. I like the idea of mapping it. So yeah, come back in part 2 and we'll try to do that.
Perfect, thank you. No more questions as of now.
All right, well, let's move on then to interactional discourse resources. So what do I mean by interactional discourse resources? Well, critical to thinking about communicative resources is to thinking about those interactional resources that help people align with one another in social material spaces. So these interactional resources can be everything from the laundry basket that was in Cindy Magic that helped keep people aligned physically with one another, to the football field that was designed to direct a home team and the guest team to other places. Interactional discourse resources then are a very sort of specialized version of interactional resources. These are ones that have recognizable discourse types associated with them that do this interactional work. IDRs are pervasive in everyday interactions. Across the literature, both inside and outside of our field, we find that they're fairly robust. In other words, they're resistant to misunderstandings. And they can be easily operationalized around interactional episodes, so not just by the forms. So the 4 that I'm going to look at here quickly are collaborative referencing, playful episodes, reported speech, and conversational narratives. So the collaborative referencing and verbal play came from the barrier task data. So this, just quickly, these are the 2 studies that I'll be drawing on here. The ethnographic study of discourse and aphasia I already pointed to. Steve's data that we just looked at the football was one of the community observations, and now we're going to look at the barrier task session. And then Melissa's dissertation study also used the same barrier task session design, but looked at patients with amnesia. So here are 2 key books that informed my barrier task design, and then Melissa's, and that have played an important role in developing SDA. Herbert Clark described language as fundamentally a collaborative process. When 2 people use language, it's like shaking hands, playing a piano duet, or paddling a 2-person canoe. It takes coordination, even collaboration, to achieve. He went on to observe that if what we really want to study is duetting, then we need to actually watch people and study people playing duets. We can't just focus on single players. And the same is true when we study language and use. Clark and his colleagues used controlled barrier task protocols to do this, to investigate how people come to agree upon what they're going to call things, what references mean. From that research, he rejected the idea that referencing involves accessing a mental dictionary, finding instead that it involves people doing heuristic searches for common ground that give meaning to particular words in contexts. So this common ground can be anything from the immediate co-present social material spaces. It can be the personal common ground. We both had dinner together last night, so we can refer to the events and the foods we experienced there. And it can be communal common ground. So most people who have gone to US schools will have covered US history and will know US presidents like Washington and Lincoln. They then identified 3 key phases for collaborative referencing: initiating, refashioning, and accepting. So on the other side, Edwin Hutchins actually studied cognition in the wild, tracing navigation on the bridge of a naval ship. He documented ways that computation of the ship's location were distributed in functional systems. And what he meant by functional systems is the ongoing dynamic assemblages of people, tools, artifacts, and material environments. From his research, he argued that the real power of human cognition lies in our ability to flexibly construct functional systems that accomplish our goals by bringing bits of structure into coordination. So whereas Clark emphasized the dynamic collaboration between 2 people, like duets, Hutchins' functional systems expands that collaboration to include artifacts like musical scores, tools like pianos, and environments like concert halls that are created over time, across space, and by more than the co-present people. So to align with these theories of distributed communication, I redesigned Clark's barrier task in multiple ways. Instead of Clark's full barrier, which was designed to force the use of spoken language, I used a partial barrier, which you can see in these pictures. Whereas Clark mostly recruited college students who were often strangers, I recruited familiar communication partners who had a motivated interest in communicating with one another and had substantial personal histories to draw on. I also loosened up the rules to make the protocol more game-like, encouraged them to communicate freely and have fun. And to optimize the success, I extended the amount of time that they played. So we had 4 sessions instead of 1. Finally, full sessions were videotaped and transcribed for analysis. So I treated these data ethnographically. So like Clark's task, this redesign still gave us repeated opportunities to observe pairs referencing target cards, but also offered a personally meaningful activity that participants could flexibly engage in. So across both studies, as we analyzed the data, we found all the pairs were successful at collaborative referencing. In the simplest way, they accurately identified and placed target cards. They also got faster with each time they played it, displaying less effort over overt collaboration across trials. They used fewer words, they took less time. And the pairs also established unique labels for each card, labels that stabilized and simplified with repeated use. Here's just an example of one from Steve, again, who has aphasia, who is directing all 6 trials in one session. He started by describing this card as figure skating like a figure skate. By the 3rd and 4th trial, he was calling it an ice skater dancing. And by the last 2, he simply said ice skater. But labels for the cards weren't always verbal. So here's a nice example from Rob and Mary. Mary was a mother with aphasia and Rob was her 16-year-old son. Mary settled on a flapping arms gesture for this card, and Rob insisted on calling it Starman. Also, Deborah and Monica described this photo card of by the family activity they did there. This was a shopping market, a shopping center. So they deliberately would change details every time while referencing this shared shopping frame. Where we go to get Amanda's milk at? You go and buy your eggs there, or baby milk. All the pairs displayed robust learning, but this was especially striking in Melissa's data, where the individuals with amnesia displayed comparable rates of learning to comparison pairs, even though from session to session, they didn't remember that they had even played the game. So this graph on the left shows the average time it took pairs managing amnesia, the filled circles, and comparison pairs to complete the trials. You see the rates are similar, although pretty consistently the comparison pairs were faster. Also on the right, you see how they handled follow-up interviews. And it doesn't matter whether it was 30 minutes, 6 months, or 2 years later, even the individuals with amnesia were able to recall most of the names for these cards. So both studies also showed creative language use, even by the partners with aphasia. Actually, in my first article on verbal play, I described some of these exchanges as linguistic mischief, because the participants often used verbal play to complicate or defeat referencing by refusing to answer questions or by refusing to offer cues when they were asked, and by even speaking in languages that their partners didn't know, like French and German. However, playful exchanges more often were used as a resource for developing meaningful labels for these target cards. So for example, Deborah had difficulty making any sense of card number 8. In the very first trial, she held it up to me toward the window. I was in the observation room and said, this, Julie, essentially complaining to me about the card. Her daughter then, Monica, then took it up as a perfect label, and they settled on calling the card Julie. One of the cards showed a photo of the SNA of our speech and hearing science building, but with a sign cut in half. Steve and Carrie played with these missing labels and called it the Each and Earing Iance building. And then, of course, this picture of Steve at his work site, they played with that and called it cheesing and mugging for the camera and some young stud. As I then, throughout the game, with all of these, I wanted to look at all the types of verbal play that was happening. So we operationally defined it and then did counts of episodes of verbal play. And what we found is that across all of these barrier task sessions, 1,005 actually episodes of verbal play that we were able to code for, and that the partners with aphasia were taking part in 48% of those. So there was a lot going on, and people with aphasia participated. So this is an example that I detailed in the article, and I will point you to that if you want to read it in detail, but it's called the mean dog theme. So Rob and Mary had a picture of their dog in their card set, and then a picture of my dog. So the first time Rob was describing it, he said, our dog inside our house with a Pente board. And when he got to the picture of my dog, he just said, okay, it's a dog, but it's not our dog. Well, Mary took this when she was directing as a perfect opportunity to tease me. So she then called that card, picture of my dog, that mean dog. Shh, she said, she held her finger up. That mean dog, her dog, not our dog. Rob was quite confused. As I came back into the room at the end of the trial, though, Mary continued to tease me about it, teasing me about that old dog before switching to an ingratiating tone. What I like about this one is how it generated a lot more conversation. So this mean dog theme continued through the rest of the game trials, through the rest of the sessions. It became a topic before, between, and after game trials. It was also signaled not just by the words, but by how it was performed, that sort of conspiratorial tone. It also became a topic of extended conversation, prompted us to think about and talk about friendship and the role of teasing, parenting and having fun, and pets and politeness. To develop systematic methods of tracing and creating the diverse, complex ways people use IDRs, I drew on researchers like Deborah Tannen and Eleanor Oakes and Lisa Capps. So Tannen had observed that ordinary conversation is made up of linguistic strategies long described as literary devices. Although these strategies are elaborated in literary discourse, she argues, they are pervasive, spontaneous, and functional in ordinary conversation. Tannen particularly highlighted uses of language that simultaneously reflect and create interpersonal involvement. Her involvement devices offer a map for some of the IDRs that we started looking at: conversational repetition, constructed dialogue, which I call reported speech, imagery, and detail that are especially part of conversational narratives. Oakes and Capps then offer a rich account of narrative, not just as a form of language, but as a communicative practice, as tellings that emerge from and shape interactions and experiences. They develop these 5 dimensions to characterize specific narratives and how they integrate with surrounding talk: tellership, tellability, embeddedness, linearity, and moral stance. So let's just look quickly at reported speech and some of our analysis of that. So constructed dialogue or reported speech shifts the speaker frame in order to quote or paraphrase words from another time or place. foregrounding in one utterance, multiple speakers and multiple contexts. I mean, we all know this and we've seen it. Direct reports are like John said, and then a quote, I'll come at 8 o'clock. Indirect reported speech, as John said, that he would be here at 8 o'clock. And then there's blended forms where you set it up like indirect, but then say it with the prosody of the original speaker. Reported speech is a creative process. It's about reporting others' words for your own purposes. So you're not necessarily doing it to extend the voice of the other person. It also is constructed dialogue, is what Tannen calls it, with little emphasis on veracity. It doesn't have to be truthful to be reported speech. Reported speech is also robust and pervasive. I love this quote from a social linguist, McCarthy, who says that news, gossip, stories, indeed the whole fabric of everyday conversation depends heavily on quoting or referring to the words of others. And it's hard to imagine a day of our lives when we do not at some point support our discourse with direct or indirect references to someone else's words. And we found that in our data. So for a study of the community observations, we operationally defined essentially 5 types or 4 types of reported speech and had an undecided category. So we did direct, indirect. We had a projected reported speech category where you would make up things like talking for animals. And we had an indexed reported speech where it was more like using pronouns to point to something that was just said, like that's what he just said. So what did we find? 509 reported speech episodes in these data. 149 by participants with aphasia, 251 by their partners, and 109 by others. So participants with aphasia were doing at least a third of them that we identified. 25 of the 28 sessions contained reported speech episodes. 19 of those sessions had episodes produced by both partners. All 14 participants produced then reported speech episodes at an average rate of 28.5 per person with a range of 1 to 78. Reported speech episodes were often accurate and complete, with 60% of those by aphasic participants coded that way and 85% for partners. And this is important to note that even the partners without aphasia didn't always do it accurately in the sense of using the right words or the right grammatical forms. So the last one I want to look at real fast here is conversational narratives. So conversational narratives are fun because they're so pervasive and also because they do so much interactional work. They shift the participation framework from conversational partners to narrative tellers and audiences. They shift the temporal spatial context from the time and place of the telling to some displaced moment of the event of the story. They often then repurpose material context, like we saw with the mud on the rug example in Cindy Magic. Conversational narratives are very creative and come in lots of forms. They can be personal narratives, synopses of books or movies, historical accounts, folk tales, fantastical accounts, and they're pervasive. Oaks and Caps capture the pervasiveness of them this way. Acquired in childhood, personal narrative is ubiquitous, whether in a store, along a road, at work, play, home, or in other community settings. When people are together, they are inclined to talk about events. Those they have heard or read about, those they have experienced directly, and those they imagine. Their talk about such events often takes the form of personal narrative. So this narrative comes from an interview with Ethel and Barney. There's 2 narratives I want to point out to, and it occurred right at the beginning of the interview, and I had just complimented them on how well they had played the barrier task game and had asked them, how do you work together to make the game successful? And then Ethel immediately launched into her, so what I'm calling her, he just gets it narrative. So let's look at the transcript here for a second. The narratives are in red and everything else is in blue. So the very first narrative is Ethel sets it up by saying all the time, then acts out a turn-by-turn past conversation. Say Walmart, and then she points to her husband. And then she points back to herself. what's your name? Oh God, because she couldn't think of the word. Then she points back to her husband. She goes, you, da, 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 and points back to herself. Oh, that's right. Then she closes with a nonverbal coda, using a filler and a gesturing back and forth gesture between her and Barney. As an active listener, I go on to say, so he understood you, you mean, even when you couldn't get the words out. And Ethel agrees. Ethel, by the way, was the participant who had the highest number of reported speech episodes, 78, that we coded in the data I just showed you. That was higher than even any of the participants without aphasia. Her MLT, though, was only 2 words. So these narratives display how highly animated even short utterances combined with gestures and pointing to the environment can support communicative success, at least with some people. This is another way to think about the highly distributed nature of everyday interaction. Okay, then in turn 18, Ethel emphasizes the uniqueness of Barney's abilities by offering a second and contrasting narrative. Again, it's presented all in one turn, and Ethel announces the speaker she is reporting, Mom. And then she acts out her mother's response, bending forward. I don't understand, she says. Then she offers a comparative evaluation by indicating Barney and reusing her back and forth hand gesture. I again verbally recast her gesture. He just gets it, and Ethel agrees. All right, so we have time now to talk about briefly the observation activity and then maybe for a few questions. So what I'm going to ask you to do and bring for next time is to start exploring IDRs in everyday interactions. So this is in your handout. Select a video about 30 minutes long of everyday interaction. You could use something from your home videos like a birthday party or holiday or clinical or research data, or you could record something new just for this observation. Watch the video through once to begin to describe what's going on here, what are people's patterns of participation, and what communicative resources are being used. Then review the descriptions of IDRs presented here in part 1, focusing on the last 3, verbal play, reported speech, and conversational narratives. And if you have trouble finding the articles cited here and want to read them, just email me and I'll help you get a hold of them. Then I want you to do a preliminary coding of verbal play, reported speech, and conversational narratives. Watch the video again, stopping to transcribe those episodes, and try to find at least 3 episodes of each. Then write a very brief reflection on your observation activity. Was this easy, difficult? Did you get stuck someplace? What did you learn? How might you use this in your research? Be sure to email me if you have questions and bring your reflections and transcripts to part 2, and we'll start part 2 by hearing what people found.
Excellent.
All right.
Thank you, Dr. Hengst. Does anybody have any questions? And for those who joined in a little later, just wanted to let you know that all these materials are available on our website, focusaphasia.com, and you can also email Dr. Hengst if you have questions and if you have to go right now.
So what we'll be doing next time is taking all of these ideas and this preliminary look at data and your observation at home to start thinking about how this impacts clinical practice. This speaks very much to Gloria's question. And so we'll begin that one by looking first at the role of the clinician as a partner in these interactions, even with our clients, and then we'll jump into what we know about rich communicative environments and look at how we can use those to construct interventions. So that'll be the goal of the next hour.
All right, well, thank you so much. I don't see any questions in the chat box, but again, we really want to thank you so much for your time and an excellent introduction to situated discourse analysis. And I hope you all can join us back on May 27th, which is the part 2 of this workshop.
Excellent. I hope to hear from you in the meantime.
Perfect. All
Thank
right.
you, everyone.
Have a nice rest of the day.